There is a version of Johnny Carson that the whole world knew. The version that walked out under those bright studio lights 5 nights a week, adjusted his tie, flashed that impossibly cool smile, and made millions of Americans laugh so hard they forgot whatever weight they had been carrying all day. He was the king, the undisputed, untouchable king of late-night television for 3 decades straight. Nobody questioned it. Nobody came close. And the thing about being that kind of king is that everyone wants a piece of you. The cameras, the networks, the guests, the advertisers, the fans, they all needed Johnny Carson. And Johnny Carson gave them everything he had. He poured every ounce of his wit, his charm, his energy into that show, into that persona, into that performance. And for 30 years, it worked beautifully. Audiences loved him. Hollywood loved him. America loved him. But here is the thing nobody really talks about, and it is the thing that makes this story so much more complicated than just another rise and fall of a famous entertainer. Behind that carefully constructed image, behind the tailored suits and the perfectly timed jokes and the effortless chemistry with every single guest who ever sat in that chair, there was a father. And that father was failing, not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing kind of way, not in a way that ever really made it onto the front page or became the subject of some big expose. Johnny Carson's failure as a dad happened quietly, slowly, in all the small moments that cameras never captured. In the silences between TV tapings and the missed birthdays and the empty chairs at dinner tables, in the way his own sons would grow up, watching him shower strangers with warmth and attention while they themselves were left waiting for scraps of it. Johnny Carson had 3 sons. Christopher, Richard, and Cory. And each of their lives tells a different chapter of the same painful story, the story of what it actually costs to be the child of someone the entire world has fallen in love with. This is not a story about fame. This is not a story about Hollywood glamour or celebrity excess. This is a story about 3 boys who grew up in the shadow of a legend and had to figure out, completely on their own, how to become men without a father who was truly present. And when you hear what happened to each of them, you will understand something about Johnny Carson that no late-night clip reel or biography has ever fully captured. You will understand the real price of being the greatest entertainer America ever had. Johnny Carson married his first wife, Joan Jody Walcott, in 1949. They had known each other since college, and at the time it seemed like the kind of classic, hopeful beginning that people used to romanticize. 2 young people in love, starting a life together full of possibility. And within just a few years, they had 3 sons. Christopher arrived in 1950, Richard came along in 1952, and then Cory was born in 1953. So by the time Johnny was barely in his mid-20s, he was already a husband and a father of 3. That is a lot of responsibility for anyone. But Johnny was not just anyone. He was a man whose entire identity was being built around performance, around public charm, around being on. And here is what that meant for his family in practical terms. It meant that the version of Johnny Carson his sons grew up with at home was almost nothing like the version the rest of the country got to enjoy every single night. The Tonight Show, Johnny was loose, quick, generous with his laughter, seemingly without a care in the world. The at-home Johnny was distant, guarded, often unavailable, and increasingly locked inside a bottle. His drinking became a serious problem, and combined with the absolutely relentless demands of hosting a nightly television show, it created a home environment that was anything but warm or stable. Johnny's first marriage didn't survive it. The relationship between him and Joan deteriorated steadily under the weight of his absence and his habits. And by 1963, the marriage ended in divorce. The boys were young. Christopher was around 12, and after the split, they stayed primarily with their father and his subsequent wives. Joan, their mother, gradually drifted out of their lives. Carson later tried to justify the divorce by saying that an honest separation was healthier for kids than growing up in a tense, unhappy household. And maybe there was some truth in that. But the harder truth, the one that his sons would eventually have to reckon with, was that Johnny simply was not around enough to understand what his children actually needed. He was married to the Tonight Show. That was the reality. And everything else, including his own flesh and blood, came second. What made this situation so uniquely painful for Chris, Rick, and Cory was not just that their father was busy, or that he worked long hours. Plenty of kids grow up with parents who work hard and are not home as much as everyone might wish. What made the Carson boys' experience so specific, so quietly devastating, was the contrast. They could turn on the television and watch their father be everything they desperately wanted him to be, just not for them. Johnny Carson was a man who could walk into any room and instantly make everyone in it feel seen, entertained, valued. He had a gift for connecting with people, for drawing them in, for making them feel like they were the only person in the world that mattered to him in that moment. And he used that gift constantly, every single night, on camera, in front of millions. But that gift was almost never turned toward his own sons. Cory Carson, the youngest, would later speak about this with a raw honesty that cut right to the heart of it. He described watching his father light up around child guests on The Tonight Show. Kids who would come on stage and get the full Johnny Carson experience. The jokes, the attention, the playful interaction. Those kids got 10 minutes of his father's undivided warmth. And Cory and his brothers, who shared a last name with him, often could not get that same quality of presence in a single day at home. It was not that Johnny did not love his sons. By most accounts, he did, in his own complicated, emotionally constrained way. But love and presence are not the same thing. And Johnny Carson's particular genius for connection was one that he had essentially turned off when he walked through his own front door. The result was 3 boys growing up, feeling like they were always on the outside of something, always watching their father perform intimacy for an audience while receiving very little of it themselves. All 3 Carson sons made a choice that, in retrospect, says everything about what they learned growing up in that household. None of them pursued fame. None of them tried to ride their father's coattails into the entertainment industry or leverage the Carson name for personal gain or public attention. Every single one of them turned deliberately away from the spotlight and built lives that were as far from Hollywood as you could get while still technically living in the same country. Cory put it simply after Johnny's death. He said the family had inherited the privacy gene. And while that was said with a touch of dry humor, there was real weight behind it. These were not men who shunned fame out of modesty or lack of ambition. They shunned it because they had seen firsthand, up close, what fame did to a person, what it did to a marriage, what it did to a household, what it did to a father. They had watched fame consume their dad from the inside out, watched it eat away at every relationship he had outside of that studio, and they wanted no part of it. So each of them built a quieter life, a smaller life, a life where the cameras stayed away and the world did not get to have an opinion about who they were or how they were doing, and for a long time that worked. The public barely knew anything about them. Devoted Carson fans could tell you every guest Johnny ever had on the show, every memorable sketch, every iconic moment, but ask them about Johnny's sons and you would get nothing but shrugs. That was by design. That was the whole point. Christopher Carson, the eldest, was born on November 7, 1950, and from the very beginning he was the one who absorbed the earliest and perhaps most confusing version of his father's absence. He was the first child, which means he was the one who had to make sense of the situation before anyone else in the family did. He watched his parents' marriage fall apart when he was barely a teenager. He watched his mother fade from his life afterward, and he watched his father move through one marriage after another, each time with the same pattern repeating itself. Johnny would marry, the demands of the show would pull him away, the relationship would strain under the weight of that distance, and eventually it would break. Chris saw this cycle play out multiple times, and rather than repeat it or rebel against it, he simply chose to disappear into a life that had nothing to do with television or fame or any of it. As an adult, Chris settled in Florida and worked as a golf instructor. It was modest work, unglamorous, exactly the kind of life that would never attract a single camera or headline under normal circumstances, and it might have stayed completely invisible forever if not for a messy personal situation that briefly dragged him into the public eye in the late 1980s. Chris had been in a long-term relationship with a woman named Tanana Love Green, and together they had a daughter, Crystal Love Carson, born in 1986. When that relationship ended, a child support dispute followed, and it ended up in court. During the 1987 proceedings, details about Chris's financial situation became public, and they painted a picture that was both sad and revealing. Despite having a job, Chris was not financially self-sufficient. His father had been quietly supporting him for years, giving him $35,000 annually, buying him a house, providing him with cars. Johnny Carson was trying, in the way he knew how, to take care of his eldest son, but that support also made clear that Chris had never quite found his own footing, never fully escaped the gravitational pull of his father's world, even while running as far from it as possible. The court case showed that Chris was a loving father to his daughter, devoted to Crystal in a way that suggested he understood what it felt like to grow up without enough of a parent's attention. But after those few weeks in the newspapers, Chris retreated right back into the silence he had built around his life, and he stayed there for decades. No interviews, no public appearances, no attempts to tell his side of the family story. When Johnny Carson died in 2005, Chris joined his brothers in issuing a quiet statement affirming the family's desire for privacy, and then he simply continued living the way he always had, quietly, privately, off the radar entirely. There is one small detail about Chris and Johnny's relationship that stands out, and it comes from a family friend named Howard Smith. It involves golf. Chris was an avid golfer his entire life, and at some point Johnny began joining him on the course. Not to play, but just to ride along in the golf cart and watch his son play. It is a small thing. It is not the stuff of dramatic family reconciliation stories or tearful Hollywood moments, but think about what it actually represents. Johnny Carson, one of the busiest entertainers on the planet, choosing to spend his time sitting in a golf cart, watching his son do something he loved. Not performing, not being funny, not entertaining anyone, just being a dad in the quietest possible way. It was one of the few glimpses anyone ever got of Johnny Carson trying to close the distance between himself and his children, and it happened so far from any camera that almost no one ever knew about it. Then, in 2025, news came out that Christopher Carson had died at the age of 74. The announcement was made not through any official statement or media event, but through a casual mention on a nostalgia podcast by Howard Smith. It was low-key, understated, entirely consistent with the way Chris had lived his whole life. He left behind his daughter, Crystal, and a legacy defined not by anything he did in public, but by everything he chose to keep private. Chris Carson lived and died the way he had always wanted to, out of the light, on his own terms, unbothered by a world that had spent decades trying to connect him to his famous father. The middle son, Richard Carson, known to everyone as Rick or Ricky, had perhaps the most interesting and tragic arc of the three brothers. Born in 1952, Rick was actually given the name Kim Arthur Carson at birth, but the nickname Ricky stuck so firmly that it eventually became his legal name, changed to Richard. Like his father before him, Rick served in the United States Navy. Johnny had served during World War II, and there was something quietly meaningful about his middle son following the same path, even if the two of them never talked much about what that shared experience meant to either of them. After his service, Rick found his calling in photography. He developed a serious eye for it, an adventurous spirit that took him to beautiful locations and pushed him to capture images that went beyond the ordinary. It was a passion that suited him perfectly, a way of seeing the world that was entirely his own, untouched by his father's shadow, defined by his own talent and curiosity. For a while, Rick lived the same kind of quiet, private existence as his brothers. He worked behind a camera, enjoyed the solitude of the craft, and stayed well away from anything resembling celebrity. But on June 21st, 1991, everything ended in an instant. Rick was 39 years old. He had been driving along California's Central Coast on a photography trip, scouting locations along the Pacific, looking for stunning natural light and dramatic coastal views. He stopped his car by the roadside to take some pictures. At some point, something went wrong. Police determined that Rick either drove off or fell from an embankment near the road. The crash was fatal. They found his camera equipment near the scene. He had been doing what he loved, right up until the very end. There was no reckless driving involved, no speeding, no impairment. It was simply a terrible, random accident, the kind that can happen to anyone in a single moment of inattention, and it ended a life that had barely begun to unfold. The impact on Johnny Carson was seismic. Johnny had spent his entire career maintaining an iron grip on his public persona, never letting the audience see him vulnerable, never breaking the fourth wall between the entertainer and the man behind the entertainer. But Rick's death cracked that wall open. When Johnny returned to host The Tonight Show after his son's passing, he did something that shocked viewers who had watched him for years. He talked about Rick. On air, in front of millions of people, Johnny opened up about his middle son in a way that was raw and personal, and deeply unlike anything audiences had ever seen from him. He spoke about Rick's personality, described him as exuberant and fun to be around, someone whose laugh was genuinely contagious. And then he showed a montage of Rick's own photographs on screen, the images his son had spent his life capturing, set to the music of Stevie Ray Vaughan. It was one of the most human moments in the history of late-night television. And it came from a man who had spent 30 years making sure no one ever saw him as anything other than unshakable. Behind closed doors, the grief was far worse than anything Johnny ever revealed on camera. People close to him said he was never truly the same after losing Rick. The guilt that had already been quietly eating at him for years suddenly became unbearable. Johnny had always known, on some level, that he had chosen The Tonight Show over his family. He had rationalized it, justified it, told himself that providing financially was enough, but Rick's death forced him to confront what all those years of absence had actually cost. And the weight of that realization haunted him for the rest of his life. In interviews toward the end of his career, Carson admitted openly that his failures as a husband and father left him with guilt that felt overwhelming. It was not something he could joke his way out of. It was simply the truth, and Rick's death had made it impossible to ignore any longer. Johnny's final Tonight Show aired in 1992, just 1 year after Rick's passing, and in that last episode Johnny brought his surviving sons on stage. Chris and Cory stood beside him, along with his fourth wife Alexis, and Johnny addressed his boys directly in front of the entire country. He acknowledged that growing up with a famous father was not easy. He told them he loved them. And he said something that sounded less like a television moment and more like a confession. He said he hoped his old man had not caused them too much discomfort. It was not a grand apology. It was not a dramatic, tearful breakdown. It was Johnny Carson, in his last moment under those lights, finally saying out loud what he had spent decades unable to say in private. And for anyone watching who understood what that family had been through, it was devastating. Cory Carson, the youngest son, was born Barry William Carson on November 2nd, 1953. His name was changed to Cory legally in 1957. Around the same time, Rick's name was also changed. As the baby of the family, Cory had a slightly different vantage point than his older brothers. He watched Chris and Rick navigate the challenges of being Johnny Carson's sons before he had to fully face them himself. He observed the patterns. He watched the marriages come and go. He saw what fame did to his father up close, in all its complexity. And by the time he was old enough to really process it, he had developed a remarkably clear-eyed understanding of who Johnny Carson actually was, separate from who the world believed him to be. Cory has been more candid than either of his brothers about what it felt like to grow up in that household. He has spoken about the specific sting of watching his father interact with child guests on The Tonight Show. Kids who got the full, brilliant entertainer version of Johnny Carson for a few minutes on camera, while Cory and his brothers received something much colder and more reserved at home. He described wondering what those kids had that he and his brothers did not. Those kids had Johnny's full attention for 10 minutes on TV. Yet his own children often struggled to get quality time with him off camera. It was a painful thing to grow up with, and Cory has never pretended otherwise. But what is striking is that he does not carry bitterness about it. He has said, plainly and without drama, that he eventually worked through those feelings, that it took years, that it required a kind of emotional reckoning that most people never have to go through, but he did it. He made peace with who his father was and who his father was not. Cory's passion, the thing that gave his life its own shape and meaning entirely outside of the Carson name, was music. He became a classical guitarist and a recording artist, dedicating himself to the craft with the same kind of quiet seriousness that defined everything else about his life. He was not performing in stadiums or appearing on talk shows or leveraging his famous surname to get gigs. He was simply playing, practicing, building a relationship with an instrument that asked nothing of him except that he show up and be present. There is something almost poetic about that. about the son of a man who could never quite be present, choosing a form of art that demanded exactly that. Like his brothers, Cory kept an almost total silence with the public for decades. After Johnny retired from The Tonight Show in 1992 and through the years that followed until Johnny's death in 2005, Cory was essentially invisible to the press. No scandals, no tell-all interviews, no attempts to cash in on the family name. When Johnny passed away, Cory joined the rest of the family in a brief, dignified statement affirming their preference for privacy. It was exactly what Johnny would have wanted. He had always said that the man on stage was a performer, but the man at home was private. His sons honored that in death, even though, in many ways, Johnny had not honored it himself in life. A few years after Johnny's passing, Cory did participate in some limited interviews and contributed to biographical projects about his father. And in those rare moments of public reflection, he showed a depth of understanding that was genuinely striking. He did not trash Johnny. He did not rewrite history to make his father look better than he was. He simply acknowledged the full, complicated truth of who Johnny Carson had been, flaws and all. And he spoke about it with a kind of grace that suggested he had done a lot of hard, quiet work to get to that place internally. He said he understood his father's failures. He said he was free of the feeling of unworthiness that had haunted him as a younger man. He called that particular struggle a biggie, and the way he said it casually, almost with a small laugh, suggested that the weight of it had finally genuinely lifted. He also noted without any real edge that Johnny had simply been better suited to being a talk show host than a father, and that many entertainers of that era were the same way. It was what it was. Today, Cory Carson is in his early 70s. He is the last surviving son of Johnny Carson, after losing Rick more than 3 decades ago and Chris just recently. Cory carries something that no amount of quiet living or emotional peace can fully soften. He is the only one left who remembers what it was like to be a Carson boy. The only one who still holds, somewhere inside him, the memory of watching his father make the whole country laugh, while his own family sat in the silence that fame left behind. By all accounts, Cory is still playing guitar, still living quietly, still honoring the privacy that became the Carson family's defining inheritance. And if there is one thing his story teaches us, it is this. Johnny Carson spent 30 years perfecting the art of making strangers feel seen. But the people who needed him most, the 3 boys who shared his blood and his name, spent their entire lives learning how to live without him, not because he was gone, but because he was always, in the ways that mattered most, somewhere else.